From ABC News. A television event. 100 years in the making. The century.
In July 1969, nearly 1 million people gathered on a steamy Florida morning, hoping to see a dream realized that's as old as man's imagination. Among them, virtually unrecognized, a silver-haired flyer from another time. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh had guided his simple single-engine plane on a celebrated journey across the ocean and into history. And here, only 42 years later, 3 men are waiting to go to the moon on the most powerful machine man has ever built. Lindbergh wrote later to one of the Apollo 11 astronauts, "My chest was beating and the ground shook as though bombs were falling nearby. Then a flame rose, leaving the ground behind, a meteor streaking the sky. It seemed impossible for life to exist while carrying that fire." What a fantastic experience it must have been, Lindbergh wrote, alone, looking down on another celestial body like a god of space. To be alone and then return to one's fellow man once more.
Tonight on The Century, Heaven and Earth.
In the early morning of February the 19th, 1927, the Pennsylvania Railroad's Gotham Limited was halfway across the Ohio Valley, headed east. On board, a young Midwesterner too nervous to sleep began a letter to his mother. Charles Lindbergh's mother was his closest friend. He told her he was going to New York to buy a plane, to win $25,000, he hoped, by being the first man to fly non-stop from New York to Paris. It wasn't so much the money, he wrote. It was his dream to make the world smaller through aviation.
This was a great story about the New Age. This was about the birth of the 20th century in some ways. This was basically going to knit the 2 continents of Europe and North America together. An airplane was going to change the future for us.
The $25,000 prize had been offered by New York hotel owner Raymond Ortigue, who was fascinated with aviation. His prize had gone unclaimed for 7 years. No one really thought flying across the Atlantic was possible. And then, in the fall of 1926, Charles Lindbergh, a restless male pilot from St. Louis, heard the news that René Fonck, the most celebrated pilot in France, would try to win the Ortigue Prize. Fonck was famous for having shot down 126 German pilots in World War I.
Unlike many heroes of World War I, Fonck lacked one of the prerequisites, modesty. Always thought he was better than he was, good though he was, and it rubbed a lot of people the wrong way.
Fonck and his 3-man crew said they would make the flight in this Sikorsky trimotor. It had been proclaimed the dream plane that would launch a new era in commercial aviation. It was certainly the most expensive and the most lavish. Leather seats and wood paneling, even a pull-out bed. It was also the heaviest. As Fonck started down the runway, he shouted, "Dinner in France." But the plane was simply too heavy to go anywhere. Fonck and his co-pilot survived, but 2 of the crew burned to death. It was something of an epiphany for Charles Lindbergh. Why did one need 3 engines? Why so much weight? Why more than one person?
The perfection in Lindbergh's plan was utmost simplicity. Reduce everything to its most basic elements. 1 pilot, 1 engine, 1 set of wings, and as few necessities in that plane as were humanly possible.
Most people just assumed that the way to fly across the Atlantic would be with a multi-engine airplane, and that was an incorrect assumption.
the 3 engines really were a waste. The 2 wouldn't really get you to safety if the 1 failed, that the extra weight was really not worth what it was. All of this is what he conceived, and really nobody else did.
Lindbergh believed that the plane he'd come to New York to buy would be better.
He had heard about a wonderful plane for sale called the Wright Bellanca. It had a Wright engine that was the most modern engine manufactured.
A single-engine plane designed by an Italian engineer, Giuseppe Bellanca, with an air-cooled American motor for long-distance flight.
There was one existing model in New York City. A man named Charles Levine owned it.
Lindbergh didn't have enough money to buy the Wright Bellanca himself, but he did get encouragement and $15,000 from several of St. Louis's wealthier citizens who he had been teaching to fly.
The people Lindbergh was asking to back him, after all, were really the movers and shakers of the city. They were newspaper publishers, they were bankers, they were leading businessmen who wanted their city to, appear to be a forward-looking, forward-thinking kind of place.
And these were people who had been interested in aviation, many of them, or who had started small aircraft companies, and their enthusiasm was quite infectious.
And so, as the Gotham Limited reached the outskirts of New York, young Lindbergh's dream plane was almost his.
Here was Charles Lindbergh, 25 years old. He looked 19. He was wearing actually some brand new clothes he had bought. He wanted to impress the people in New York that he wasn't just some bumpkin from the Midwest.
Almost anyone from the Midwest would find New York a bit much in the 1920s.
This was a very hostile environment for him. This was too big, too loud, just too much, too many people.
Here, more than anywhere else in the country, America was rushing towards the future. Charles Lindbergh grew up where leisure time had to be earned. Here there was leisure and pleasure on every corner. New Yorkers were testing the tolerance of a deeply puritanical country at every turn. Lindbergh wanted to conquer the sky. Here, what soared was the new architecture. It was to the world's tallest building, the Woolworth Building, that Lindbergh went to buy his plane. In the corporate office of the Columbia Aircraft Corporation, Lindbergh asked to see the chairman. Charles Levine was 28. He owned the Wright Bellanca that Lindbergh wanted.
Levine was a self-made millionaire. His father had sold scrap iron. He was very much out to make a social splash, trying to gain quick fame somehow that might accelerate his acceptance in the society.
But alas, when Lindbergh got to New York City, Mr. Levine said, sure, I've got this plane to sell, no problem at all, but who's going to fly the plane? And Lindbergh said, obviously, I'm going to fly the plane. And Mr. Levine said, I don't think so. I mean, I've never really heard of you. We basically sell planes to famous pilots, and certainly more seasoned pilots.
A famous pilot in 1927 generally meant a pilot who had distinguished himself during World War I, a man with not only a lot of experience, but a certain amount of publicity.
But in Lindbergh, Levine saw only a glorified delivery boy. He didn't know much about airmail pilots.
In 1925, of the first 40 airmail pilots, 31 died. There was no more dangerous job in the United States than delivering the mail, and there was no one better than Lindbergh.
Flying the mail between St. Louis and Chicago. Lindbergh was signing up to fly through some of the worst weather on the North American continent. Snowstorms, blizzards. This period that he spent flying the airmail really was a graduate course in piloting.
And surviving.
The first time I'd heard of Lindbergh was when he was flying the mail between St. Louis and Chicago, and it had to bail out of his airplane because of bad weather.
This is Charles Lindbergh actually bailing out of an airmail plane. On 4 occasions, a parachute would save him. After his unsuccessful meeting with Levine, Lindbergh went back to St. Louis on the train.
My father was tremendously disappointed and outraged. I don't think it ever entered his head that anyone would think he was not qualified to fly the plane.
Even before Lindbergh left New York, the pressure of competition became more apparent. The newspapers reported 2 impressive new contenders.
Several other pilots had come to the same realization that Charles Lindbergh had, namely that the machinery was sophisticated enough now to make this particular flight.
Two reserve naval officers, Noel Davis and Stanton Worcester, announced that they would cross the Atlantic in a stripped-down three-engine Army bomber. And more daunting still, Commander Richard Byrd, the first man to fly to the North Pole, announced that he would try. Byrd intended to fly the America, a state-of-the-art three-engine Fokker. He was particularly well supported with money from a large aviation company.
There were actual syndicates in some cases paying a lot of money for huge tri-motored planes that could make the trip.
And by the time Lindbergh got back to St. Louis, three more contenders with corporate sponsorship said they would try. When Lindbergh met with his St. Louis backers, he felt obliged to tell them, "I'm behind all my competition." It was quiet in the room. He wrote in his diary, "I thought they might ask for their money back." Lindbergh was depressed. If he couldn't have the right Belanca, where would he get a plane? As we'll see in a moment, he was about to get lucky. On February the 22nd, 1927, when a disappointed Lindbergh met his backers in St. Louis, he had no real reason to be nervous. They were behind him all the way. Among them, Harold Bixby, president of the Chamber of Commerce, and E. Lansing Ray, publisher of the leading paper, the Globe Democrat.
He was one of them. They knew of his record as a Midwestern mail flyer, and they knew what he could do. And they felt that if Lindbergh succeeded, St. Louis, which was then establishing aircraft industries of its own, could be looked upon as more than just the gateway to the West, but the gateway to the air age.
They had heard about another company that was willing to sell them an airplane, that was willing to build a plane all according to Lindbergh's specifications.
The company was Ryan Airlines in San Diego. Without even unpacking, Lindbergh got on the train and went to California.
I think finding Ryan is an unbelievable act of destiny, because I think that their conception of the plane and their ability to come together, the people who work there, who I think saw this as something special, I think that made the flight.
The chief engineer at Ryan, a very modest company, was Donald Hall. Lindbergh sensed immediately that Hall understood his vision. Sitting at drafting tables, facing each other, the two men began. More than anything else, Lindbergh feared going off course over the Atlantic and running out of gas. He had only a compass for navigation, and there would be no landmarks for most of the way. "How far was it to Paris?" Hall asked one day as they worked on designing the gas tanks. Lindbergh wasn't sure.
And he went to the great globe sitting in the public library in San Diego and actually laid some string across to measure the distance from New York to Paris.
3,600 miles. At 10 gallons an hour, 360 gallons, plus a reserve in case of an emergency. Lindbergh knew that his life depended on having enough gas.
Lindbergh said he wanted three things to be observed in this order: efficiency, safety, and then and only then comfort. This meant that the plane should have little more than gasoline tanks.
Unlike every other challenger for the transatlantic prize, Lindbergh would fly alone, even though it meant no sleep for nearly 2 days. The weight of a co-pilot meant an extra 50 gallons of gas. Lindbergh was ruthless about saving weight. He eliminated fuel gauges. Based on 10 gallons an hour, he would keep track of consumption using his wristwatch. Instead of a heavy metal seat, he had a light wicker chair. He estimated how much his drinking water would weigh, and he even trimmed the paper margins from his maps. And he would not take a parachute. 4 times a parachute had saved his life. This time Lindbergh would save 20 pounds.
He figured he wouldn't need it if he went down in the Atlantic. He would probably die in its icy waters anyway.
And so they did design this plane, which in the end has no forward vision, in fact. Right in front of the pilot, where a windshield might normally be, were in fact gas tanks. And this was going to be little more than a flying gas tank.
I don't think he probably had much interest in anybody else's way of getting across the ocean.
It took 6 weeks to design and build the plane. His financial backers had suggested the name. They were, after all, interested in the publicity. No sooner did the Spirit of St. Louis begin rigorous flight tests than word came from New York that Charles Levine, who thought Lindbergh unqualified to fly his Wright Belanca, had found a pilot he liked. He would try for Paris. And almost on top of that, a French team announced that it would try the other way, from Paris to New York. The chief French pilot was Charles Nungesser.
Nungesser had a sense of humor and a joie de vivre that appealed to the French. He had survived more crashes, injuries, and wounds than any other single pilot of World War I. His energy was boundless, and he seemed to be invincible.
His co-pilot, Francois Colli, was equally famous for his swashbuckling personality. They had also decided to go with a single-engine plane, which they emblazoned with the death-mocking symbol of their wartime days. There were now 5 contenders for the prize. Lindbergh's name was barely mentioned.
You have to remember that nobody in his right mind considered the possibility that you could fly by yourself. Even Nungesser and Colli, who had a single-engine plane, no one thought that you could simply stay awake for over 30 hours. This is why he was a fool and crazy.
Lindbergh was intimidated by the competition. He wrote in his diary, everyone else would have to fail for me to succeed. And then they did. On a test flight, Commander Richard Byrd brought the America in for what should have been a routine landing.
His plane completely overturned. I mean, it looked like complete fatal disaster. Miraculously, he was able to walk away from this crash.
The Wright Belanca, owned by Charles Levine, got into trouble landing on its maiden flight. The landing gear collapsed. The Navy flyers Noel Davis and Stanton Worcester were on their final test flight over Virginia. Nobody knows exactly what went wrong, but in these early days of flight, so much could go wrong and did. Davis and Worcester crashed in a swamp, and both were killed. After 2 weeks of his own flight testing, Charles Lindbergh was almost ready to try for Paris when he saw the headlines. The French team of Nungesser and Colli had taken off from Paris and were already said to be well out over the Atlantic, en route to New York.
Nungesser and Colli were the great French hope. This was going to be a glorious moment for France.
It was a terrible letdown for Lindbergh, though according to his autobiography, he began immediately to think of another challenge.
Lindbergh assumed that they would succeed, and he was thinking about alternative plans, the possibility of flying the Pacific.
In the next few hours, the French team was said to have been sighted off the coast of Newfoundland, and then Nova Scotia, and even Boston. In New York City, people began to gather at the Statue of Liberty, hoping to catch a glimpse of history. The city prepared an official welcome. In Paris, the morning papers were reporting that the French team had already arrived. Joyful Parisians celebrated in the streets. But the Frenchmen never made it.
Charles Nungesser and Francois Colli disappear into the mist. They're seen leaving the French coast. Everyone assumes that this is it. These guys are going to make it.
There were search parties sent out on land and on sea looking for them, assuming that they were still all right. But with each day, of course, the hopes were dashed.
They were never found, nor was their plane. So much national honor was at stake that in France there were rumors the U.S. had given the Frenchmen inaccurate weather forecasts. 6 men had now lost their lives. A chorus of voices demanded that the race be stopped. The U.S. ambassador to France, Myron Herrick, cabled Washington to say an American attempt would be inappropriate at the time.
Even Lindbergh himself felt very sad about that when he learned that they didn't make it.
But Lindbergh also recognized that he was a contender again. He said a quick goodbye to the men and women who'd built his plane in California and took off for New York.
He said, "I don't believe in taking unnecessary risks." And then he also said, "But a life without risk is not worth living."
Thursday, May the 12th, 1927, Lindbergh was approaching New York. It had taken him just 22 hours to fly from San Diego.
I didn't know very much about Lindbergh before he came to New York. It was difficult for me to understand why a young man of his background could be considered a possibility. And as for his chances, we couldn't even begin to estimate his chances.
The press had been giving Lindbergh's rivals much more attention, Commander Richard Byrd and Levine's pilot for the Wright-Bellanca, Clarence Chamberlain. But now, aware that Lindbergh was about to set a new cross-country record, they were there when he landed at Curtis Field on New York's Long Island.
He is unable to land where he wants to land. First of all, there are so many photographers. And Lindbergh's seen people run into propellers, okay? And he's screaming to them, and no one's listening because they're all trying to get shots of the plane. Lindbergh has to bank the plane, gun the engine, and avoid where he's going to land and land someplace else because he's afraid he's going to kill these people.
Despite its proven speed, reporters examining the Spirit of St. Louis were skeptical that the plane could make it across the ocean in one piece.
I'd never heard of that particular aircraft before. I didn't consider myself an expert on aviation, but all the publicity had been on the big aircraft that were being flown by the two well-known pilots.
Several newspapers took to calling Lindbergh the Flying Fool, and they made fun of his wicker chair.
One reporter made a remark that, "Oh, he's going to fly by himself on a single-engine airplane. He must have got away from his keeper."
Friday the 13th, the entire press corps was now focused on what they all called the Great Race. All three contenders appeared ready to go as soon as there was a break in the weather. But a low-pressure system over the Atlantic kept them on the ground for the next 7 days. Lindbergh and the other pilots took rooms at the nearby Garden City Hotel. Reporters from all 15 New York newspapers believed they were on the story of the century.
They really did turn this into an incredible horse race. Here was Commander Byrd, who was a bit of a peacock, and there was Clarence Chamberlain, who always wore sort of a goofy cap. But there was Lindbergh, 25 years old, impossibly good-looking. I mean, he was really more attractive than any movie star, modest beyond words, was clearly not interested in talking to the press, was literally interested in somehow performing this feat.
The reporters weren't interested in an in-depth study of Lindbergh's theory of how his flight was going to go. They basically were rude, insensitive, and from Lindbergh's point of view, asked really stupid, inane questions, like, do you have a girlfriend? Are you going to take a rabbit's foot? What's your favorite pie?
I think every woman in America fell in love with him a little bit. And certainly at 15, I was obviously in love with him.
I think most girls did have crushes on Lindbergh for what he did and for how handsome he was.
Lindbergh's hangar at Curtis Field was practically overrun by his female admirers. The boldest ones proposed marriage or asked to join him on his flight to Paris. It was all a bit much for Lindbergh.
This was a boy who didn't smoke, he didn't drink, he didn't go out on dates. Charles Lindbergh was a virgin until his wedding night.
Well, my father was certainly not typical of what they call the Roaring Twenties.
For one thing, Lindbergh was not much for talking about himself. He was born in Detroit, but raised on an isolated farm in the Minnesota wilderness. His father, Carl Augustus Lindbergh, a rather remote figure, was a Swedish immigrant with political ambitions. In 1906, the elder Lindbergh was elected to Congress, and Charles, age 5, joined his father on the House floor for the opening session. His mother, Evangeline Land, was a high-strung schoolteacher from a prominent Detroit family.
Evangeline used to come in every night, tuck him into bed, and then shake hands goodnight.
Young Charles was terribly shy and had virtually no friends at school. His mother was his closest companion all the way through college.
Here's Charles Lindbergh at the University of Wisconsin living with his mother, who has moved off to be with him. And it was a little peculiar.
At first, when his mother, who was living in Detroit, learned that Lindbergh was involved in this race for Paris, she was fairly resigned to it. And then the press found her.
And the press tracked her down, camped out on her front porch, hounded her over the phone, convinced her that there was enough risk in her son's flight that she sent the telegram that she was coming east.
I think it would have driven him crazy that there were press accounts that would frighten her so much that she felt she had to come and be with him.
When photographers asked mother and son to hug each other, Evangeline said it was not their custom, which made no difference at all to one tabloid.
A common practice of the day was to do a composite photograph, and they just took their heads and put them on other bodies and ran it anyway. And of course, this was part of Lindbergh's rude awakening to the practices of American journalism.
But having been reassured that her son had planned the trip carefully, Mrs. Lindbergh went back to Detroit. Thursday night, May the 19th, after 7 straight days of stormy weather, Lindbergh and some acquaintances were on their way to the theater when they made one more check with the Weather Bureau. There was a sudden change in the weather. They turned the cab around and headed straight for the airfield.
It's now or never, because I think he knows that Bird will go at any moment, maybe even that morning. And one of the things that is in Lindbergh's favor, and he says it, is he had only himself to think about.
I stayed up all night in the lobby of the Garden City Hotel on that miserable night, sitting on the floor. No seats available because everybody was crowded in the lobby.
At first, the press had mocked him, but now they were cheering for him.
The whole place had come alive somehow. It was just filled with journalists clattering away, tapping out the next day's stories. Although they were meant to be impartial, they had clearly found a favorite in Charles Lindbergh. I mean, he was the one. Everyone was rooting for the kid flyer.
I was on duty, the only one on duty. Night bellboy, I worked alone. And he said to me, "Kid, would you look up at the sky at 1:30 in the morning and see if it is clearing or the drizzling stopped?" I went outside, looked up at the sky. It was really clearing. I buzzed his room. I said, "Mr. Lindbergh, it seems to be clearing." Didn't take probably 15 minutes that he was dressed.
Lindbergh arrived at the airfield having had no sleep. He expected to see his competitors getting ready to take off as well. To his surprise, they were not there. Bird wanted to put the America through more tests, and the Wright Belanca, it turned out, was under court order to stay put because its owner, Charles Levine, was in a legal dispute with the pilots over money. At dawn on May the 20th, the Spirit of St. Louis was pulled from its hangar to the end of the Roosevelt Field runway.
The weather that morning was rather chilly and overcast and murky and hazy.
Even at such an early hour, there were several hundred spectators there believing they might witness history.
Almost anybody in the United States who read a newspaper or listened to the radio or had a neighbor knew that Charles Lindbergh was about to take flight.
So we all hurried and scurried around, my mother and father, and they awakened my brother and me, and over in the dark, we went to see this takeoff.
I think most of the non-aviation people out there expected a crash. They were out there to see a disaster.
The Spirit of St. Louis weighed only 2,100 pounds, but it was carrying 2,800 pounds of fuel.
So this will be the first time it has ever, if ever, it gets off the ground, successfully left the Earth that heavily burdened.
At the end of the runway, you could see the telephone lines that loomed as a possible trap. And after 7 days of rain, the mile-long dirt runway was now muddy and soft. Lloyd's of London, which had been taking bets on who would cross the Atlantic first, would not even give odds on Lindbergh's chances. Commander Richard Byrd showed up to say goodbye, the moment captured by a Fox movie camera crew, also making history. This is the first news film ever taken with simultaneous sound.
Will you go back and pick up your man? We want him up here.
At 7:51, Lindbergh stuffed cotton in his ears, pulled down his goggles and shouted, "What do you say? Let's try it." Lindbergh had vowed that if he was not airborne by the time he was halfway down the runway, he would throttle down and give up.
It's as though the mud is just pulling it down. It just cannot get off the ground.
Each time it bounced, he had to feel whether it was ready to fly or not.
At the very last moment, the plane suddenly came unglued from the earth. He cleared the telephone wires by 20 feet.
There was a great relief, but there was no clapping. There was no joyful noises at all, just relief that his plane had cleared those wires.
When I saw him take off, I shook my head and I said, we'll probably never see the poor guy again. I can still see it vividly to this day.
Only 200 feet up, cruising at 105 miles an hour, Lindbergh followed the New England coastline north. At Plymouth, Massachusetts, he headed out over the sea with only his compass to guide him to his next landmark, Nova Scotia, 250 miles away.
This is a crucial test for him, because this is going to be a test of his navigational skills. Did he chart the trip correctly in the first place, and has he stuck to that chart?
His senses dulled from not having slept the previous night. Lindbergh almost missed the fact that Nova Scotia was underneath him. How, he wondered, could he stay alert for 2 more days?
He always thought that somebody else would have and could have done it, that it was the airplane and it was the planning. And yet I do think that it was his own focus and fire that made this flight successful.
Beyond Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, the final cold reaches of North America. Just at dusk, Lindbergh flew low over the capital, St. John's, the last human settlement for 1,900 miles. I felt, he wrote later, like I was leaving the earth behind.
The only report was that he was sighted somewhere over Newfoundland, heading out to sea.
The government wireless station at Cape Rave, Newfoundland, reported that Lindbergh passed overhead at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time.
This was the first time that radio had ever played such an important part in any event. Everywhere, people rushed to listen to the radio.
The weather is reported as poor.
The radio was the only way we could keep up with the story. The newspapers were on certain edition deadlines, and there was no television.
People went next door to friends' houses if they didn't have radios. I think half of America stayed home, glued to radios. You kind of held your breath, and where is he now, and what's happening? Can he possibly make it?
Never has a single person been so alone in the universe. You know, even astronauts, when they went to the moon, were in some ways guided by remote control, had every heartbeat, every breath monitored by somebody down on Earth. Lindbergh was completely alone.
Throughout the long night, Lindbergh struggled desperately to stay awake, leaving his windows open, hoping the cold air would help. His eyes, he said later, felt as dry as stones. When the cold air didn't work, he brought the Spirit down until she was 10 feet above the waves, and the spray could hit him in the face.
Make no mistake about it, this was a death-defying deed. This was one man alone who was challenging the elements, challenging machinery, and challenging his own body.
This is WJZ, New York. George Hicks reporting. As Saturday dawned over the vast Atlantic, the Lindbergh plane is unreported since passing Newfoundland early last night.
At the beginning of his third day without sleep, Lindbergh himself didn't know where he was. An ice storm during the night had caused his compass to malfunction. His mind began to play tricks on him. He thought he saw ghosts in the cabin. Was that land ahead or a strange mirage?
There were rumors at one point that the plane had crashed. I mean, there was every kind of rumor. And then all of a sudden, there was what we thought was still a rumor that he had been spotted over Ireland. I mean, people screamed.
This is Station 2RN Dublin calling. The American flyer Lindbergh passed over Dingle Bay on the Irish coast at a low altitude at 1:30 this afternoon.
Seeing the rocky coast of Ireland, Lindbergh later wrote, "I've been to eternity and back, and I know how the dead would feel." In Paris, it was a warm spring day. At Roland-Garros Stadium, the tennis finals of the French Open were underway.
I was at the Roland-Garros Stadium in St. Cloud. The stadium was packed, and all of a sudden, word began to go through the people at the stadium like wildfire that there was a fellow flying the Atlantic.
Suddenly in the stands, the newsboys started yelling, "Lindbergh sighted over Ireland." And everybody got up and rushed out. And I don't know to this day who won the tennis championship.
By bus, by taxi, by whatever means they could find, people began to leave Paris, heading towards Le Bourget, the city's airfield.
I was a student. We thought we'd visit England and France. We wound up our tour in France. And there we learned at the time that Lindbergh was due to come and land at Paris. That was the coincidence that made the pride and joy of my life.
You can't imagine how tiny Le Bourget Airport was and how little the roads were. Getting there, they were jammed and packed, and it was all on rumor, on speculation. It seemed such a highly improbable, even impossible thing. People were intrigued by it.
And the tops on the cab slid open at that time, and everybody had bought a bottle of something, and we were all drinking and exchanging bottles and so forth.
Ici Radio Paris. Un bateau pêcheur près de Cherbourg vient de nous informer.
A French radio report now put Lindbergh just 3 hours from Paris.
L'aéroplane de Lindbergh est arrivé à la côte de France à 3 heures de distance de Paris.
The excitement got greater and greater, and the party began. There was literally dancing in the streets of Paris. This was, well, it was certainly the most exciting night in Paris since the end of the Great War.
It seemed like there was hundreds of thousands of people all over, no longer on the roads, on the grass, everywhere.
Lindbergh had no idea what awaited him.
He thought that he would land in Paris, he would need letters of introduction, that he would need to have a little cash as soon as he could get it.
At 10 p.m., Lindbergh saw a constellation of lights. In their midst, he would soon recognize a brightly lit column, the Eiffel Tower. He knew now that Le Bourget would be 13 miles to the northeast.
Very suddenly, you could hear this small noise, and it grew a little louder and a little louder. And suddenly, this small plane caught in a shaft of light from the ground at Le Bourget came into view of all these people. People were incredulous. The sound of the crowd was one of a jubilation and unbelief, disbelief, the like of which I can't conceive of happening today about anything.
It was just electric.
I guess this was about the luckiest thing that ever happened to me.
Confused by all the lights, Lindbergh decided to touch down at the other end of the airfield at 10:24, May the 21st, 1927. Lindbergh looked around for a mechanic. What he saw was a human tidal wave.
And all hell broke loose. They just swarmed. They got past the barriers. It was scary.
150,000 people, even the French police and French soldiers sent to protect him, joined the crowd.
He belonged to the world in 1 second as his wheels set down at Le Bourget.
The woman who became his wife, Anne Morrow, wrote sometime later, fame, opportunity, wealth, and also tragedy, loneliness, and frustration rushed at him in those running figures on the field at Le Bourget.
This is Lowell Thomas in New York. He made it. Charles A. Lindbergh, Lucky Lindy as they call him, landed at Le Bourget Airport, Paris at 5:24 this afternoon.
The noon whistle, and then the church bells began to ring. Lindbergh had landed, and so they're ringing the bells, and you went outside to listen to them.
In New York City, they literally, it was a Saturday afternoon, they literally stopped matinees in the middle of the show. Whistles began to go off, horns honked, traffic stopped. It was just pandemonium.
F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote, a young Minnesotan who seemed to have nothing to do with his generation did a heroic thing. And for a moment, people set down their glasses in country clubs and speakeasies and thought of their old best dreams. Back at the airfield, Lindbergh, under siege, wasn't sure if he was in a dream or a nightmare. They had pulled him from his cockpit and were passing him through the crowd, hand to hand.
Literally, people grabbed at him that night. They ripped at his clothes. They tried to rip his flesh. When they couldn't rip him, they literally tore pieces of the spirit of St. Louis.
At the American Embassy the next afternoon, Lindbergh awoke from a long sleep. 1 million people packed the streets for just a glimpse of him. At his side was his host, the U.S. Ambassador, Myron Herrick. Here was the very best thing that had happened since the end of a devastating war. Here there was hope to be celebrated. Lindbergh had wanted to see Europe, but America was impatient to see him. President Coolidge sent the USS Memphis to bring him home.
This is Rail McNamara speaking from Washington, D.C.
Here's the boy. He's come forward awfully nice. His mother is following.
That's the moment that literally grown men stood there and began to cry, because this mother was reunited with the boy the world thought she might never see again.
New York's ticker tape parade was extraordinary. 4 million people showed up, 2 out of every 3 New Yorkers.
Lindbergh's ticker tape parade still hasn't been surpassed. The police warned the citizens of New York against burglaries that they feared because burglars would know that every apartment in New York would basically be empty.
The parade that went down Broadway, the people went wild. They were throwing things out of windows, telephone books. Why half the people weren't killed, I don't know.
In some cases, people were reading more into Lindbergh than actually existed. In some ways, he really was like this blank screen onto which Americans especially projected their own best images of what Americans should be.
He was, in an instant, the 20th century's first enormous celebrity. Lindbergh got 4 million letters, 10,000 marriage proposals. Businesses offered him millions of dollars. He turned them down.
I think my father, with those wings, represented and carried America for us. And everybody felt part of that flight and part of his life.
He wasn't doing it for the vanity. He wasn't doing it for money. He wasn't doing it for fame. He was doing it to show what he could do, what aviation could do, what mankind could do.
Charles Lindbergh, the reluctant hero. I'm Peter Jennings. For the Century, good night.
You can read more about this remarkable time in the century, written by Peter Jennings and Todd Brewster, published by Doubleday and sold in bookstores everywhere. Also look for the Century audiobook edition, available on compact disc and audio cassette.